Hello and welcome to Bread of Life. Our speaker for this week is Pastor Greg Hendrickson of New Haven.
This week we've been considering God's purpose for us in adversity and in prosperity by looking at some verses from Deuteronomy chapter 8. And so far we've seen that God uses adversity to teach us to depend on Him, to test us, to humble us, and to discipline us as His children, as a loving Father. And we've also seen that prosperity is a good gift from God, but at the same time, it's a great spiritual danger. And today we'll consider three final applications from this chapter about how we can live faithfully in both adversity and in prosperity. Number one, remember the lessons of adversity. Verse 2 says, "Remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you, these 40 years in the wilderness." Moses says to the people, remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness during this time of adversity. As human beings, we're constantly tempted to live only in the present, to be consumed by our present feelings, our present thoughts, and our present circumstances. If you've ever struggled with depression, this feeling can be acute. It's almost impossible to see beyond the present darkness. But God's Word always calls us to look outside of ourselves and outside of the present moment, to remember God's faithfulness in the past, and to look forward to the future that He has promised to us through Jesus Christ. But the same pattern is just as important when we're comfortable and prosperous. Someone once said to me, never doubt in the dark what God has shown you in the light. And I think that's right. But this passage seems to be saying something like, never forget in the light what God has shown you in the dark. Remember how God has tested you. Remember how He has humbled you. Remember how He has disciplined and trained you. Don't forget the lessons of adversity. Second, remember the source of your prosperity. Moses says in verse 17, beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth. In other words, prosperity is a gift from God. We can't ultimately take credit for all that we have. As Jesus said in His parables, we are managers, not owners, of all that we have. Not too long ago, a family in my church invited me to their new apartment. And they said to me, we believe that God has given us this new apartment. It's larger than what we had previously, so we always want to have a guest room available. If you know someone who needs a place to stay, please ask us. One of the members of this family had previously been homeless. He remembered what it was like to be homeless, and he knew that their family's new apartment was truly God's provision. So we see that we are to remember the lessons of adversity, to remember the source of our prosperity, and finally remember the greatest treasure of all. The people of Israel failed the test of adversity in the wilderness. They rebelled and didn't trust God. And when they entered the promised land, they would fail the test of prosperity as well. They forgot God and turned to idols. And so ultimately, as we look further ahead in the Old Testament, God eventually took away their land. He sent them into exile, back into the wilderness, just as He threatened to do. And yet, there was another who faced both adversity and prosperity, and he was completely faithful to God in both. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, faced adversity, and He remained faithful, even to the point of death on the cross. But Jesus had also experienced prosperity. Unmatched prosperity, the glory of God's very being. For all eternity, all the glory and all the riches in the world were His by right. But out of His great love for us, He willingly took on our burdens. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, though He was rich, for our sake He became poor, that we by His poverty might become rich. Jesus Christ is the greatest treasure of all. If you're facing adversity, your adversity may last for a time, but knowing Jesus will last forever. And if you're in the midst of prosperity, your prosperity may last for a time, but only knowing Jesus will last forever. Treasure Him above all things. Through Him, through Jesus, you can face adversity or prosperity. This is how Paul could say in Philippians chapter 4, I've learned, in whatever situation I am in, to be content. I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me.
You've been listening to Pastor Greg Hendrickson of New Haven, and this has been Bread of Life, a program to encourage you from God's Word.